unexplainable scream during my night shift. This incident happened about 7 years ago. Back then, I worked as a security guard, the type that travels around the city to perform routine checks on various properties. My job involved ensuring doors, windows, and gates were properly locked, confirming there were no unauthorized people on site, checking for fire hazards, and responding to SOS or robbery alarms. One of the locations on my route was a mall, where our contract required us to perform 2 security walkthroughs each night. The first walkthrough took place right after the mall closed. During this round, we cleared out lingering customers, locked doors and entrances, checked all the alarm systems, ensured the mall was empty of both customers and employees, and activated all the alarms. The second walkthrough happened much later, in the middle of the night. During this round, we confirmed that all entrances remained locked and conducted another interior sweep to ensure the property was secure. On this particular night, the first walkthrough went smoothly. Just the usual few customers taking their sweet time to leave. However, something very strange happened during the second walkthrough. I started by walking around the mall, making sure everything was in order and all entrances were locked. I then entered the building to check the alarm monitoring system, where everything appeared normal. No error codes or logs, indicating anyone had entered after I left earlier. I worked my way from the top floor down, checking each level carefully. Everything seemed fine until I reached the basement. The basement had 2 main areas, a toy store on one side and a large playroom opposite it. Both were separated from the central hallway by glass walls. As I conducted my usual check of the basement, I noticed a sticker on the toy store door advertising a sale. Collectibles 50% off. Curious, I walked up to the glass door and shone my flashlight toward the collectibles section. While I was focused on the display, I suddenly heard a loud scream behind me. It was incredibly loud, so much so that I instinctively wanted to cover my ears. The scream sounded like a little girl yelling, "Mommy!" But it had a desperate, raspy, almost eerie tone to it. Like a death scream, if that makes sense. I froze, quickly turned around, and shone my flashlight down the hallway and into the playroom. I stood there for a solid 10 to 15 seconds, scanning the area and trying to figure out where the sound had come from. Gathering myself, I immediately thought that maybe a child had been accidentally left behind in the playroom when the mall closed. I rushed into the playroom and searched through all the toys and plushies, but I couldn't find anyone. Determined to be thorough, I double-checked every corner of the basement. Still, there was no one there. At this point, I began to suspect that my colleague, whose shift had ended hours earlier, was trying to prank me. I went back upstairs to check the alarm and surveillance systems, but there were no logs indicating anyone else had accessed the area. I reviewed the surveillance footage, and the only person visible on the cameras was me. I couldn't help but chuckle at myself, imagining how ridiculous I must have looked, jumping at a scream in the dark. Trying to rationalize the incident, I convinced myself that it had to be a toy in the store with a malfunctioning voice box. Still, it was strange that the sound had come from the hallway, or playroom, not the store itself. The next day, I visited the toy store and asked the staff if they had any dolls or toys with voice boxes that might have malfunctioned. To my surprise, they said they didn't sell any such toys. I also asked about baby monitors or similar devices, but they didn't carry those either. The staff told me that every morning they cleaned the playroom and tidied up any toys left behind. If they found toys that didn't belong to them, they would record it and place the item in storage. However, they hadn't found any stray toys that could explain what I heard. I'm naturally a skeptic and don't believe in ghosts. I always try to find logical, non-supernatural explanations for unusual events. But to this day, I cannot explain what happened during that night shift. What do you think it could have been? Do you have any reasonable explanations for what I experienced? My son's imaginary friend. For context, my son is 6 years old and on the autism spectrum. He has never heard the story I'm about to share, nor does he know any details about it. I'll explain what he said and did after providing some background. When I was around 3 or 4 years old, I had an imaginary friend named Peter, though I called him Petey. We played together often, and at the time, I thought nothing of it. However, when I was about 10 years old, my mother explained something unsettling to me. Apparently, my older brother, who is now 29 years old, also had imaginary friends when he was younger. He was 14 years old when my mother told me this. His imaginary friends were named Petey, John, and Jack. According to my mother, both my brother and I had spoken to these same friends, though I don't remember much from that time, and my brother's memories are also vague. Here's where it gets disturbing. My mother said that Jack was a mean, malevolent figure who told us to do terrible things. Things no child should ever even think about. Jack allegedly encouraged us to harm ourselves, hurt others, and worse. My mother told my brother not to interact with Jack, and to only talk to the good ones, Petey and John. My mother believed that Petey and John were trying to protect us from Jack. According to her, they told us about the terrible things their father, Jack, had done to them. Years later, in 2016, when my brother and I were 16 and 20 years old, respectively, we discovered something chilling that tied it all together. The house we lived in during our childhood had been the site of a gruesome murder-suicide. Years before we moved in, a man named Jackson had sexually abused his 2 sons, Peter, who was 6 years old, and Jonathan, who was 13 years old, before killing them and himself. Piecing everything together, it seemed that the spirits of the 2 boys were trying to warn and protect us from their father's lingering malevolence. Now, fast forward to the present. My son has been experiencing severe behavioral issues recently. When we asked him why he was acting out, he said his friend Jack told him to do bad things. He added that his friend Petey plays with him when we're busy. Alarmed, we asked him, "Who are Jack and Petey?" His reaction was deeply unsettling. His entire face changed. His lips puckered into an O shape, and he rolled his eyes so far upward, it looked as though they were disappearing. Then he covered his ears and said loudly, "God said, I can't talk to you." We tried to ask him who God said he couldn't talk to, but he went completely blank. He stood up, walked away quietly, and didn't say another word about it. For context, my son sometimes makes strange facial expressions due to stemming from his autism, but this reaction was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I don't think this is possession or anything like that, but I'm genuinely concerned and unsure of what to do. Has anyone else experienced something similar? Any advice or insights would be greatly appreciated. The Nice Old Lady. I have many ghost stories to share because dead family members and others have visited me and my family for years. Most of these encounters have happened in my own house, which makes it harder for people to believe me. But this story is different. It took place in broad daylight, at a bus stop, with a witness who saw exactly what I did. It was early June 2019, graduation day for the 3rd years at my high school. Since it was a special occasion, all students were dismissed around lunchtime, after saying goodbye to their classmates. I was a 2nd-year student and had no interest in watching other people graduate, so I decided to catch the bus home immediately after we were let out. Only one other student had the same idea, a 1st year, I think. While the rest of the students were probably still at school, making plans with their friends, we arrived at the high school bus stop around the same time. Already sitting there was an old lady with a cane. She looked to be about 80 or 90 years old and struck up a conversation with me right away. She asked if it was graduation day because so many people were gathered around the school entrance. I told her it was, and she started talking about how she had been one of the first to graduate from our high school. She mentioned that she had studied to become a doctor or nurse. Our conversation lasted about 5 minutes. Every so often, I glanced at the other student who was standing nearby. He wasn't part of the conversation, but was clearly listening. Soon, I saw the bus coming over the hill. I turned to watch as it approached, and the bus pulled up to the stop within 5-10 seconds. As I stepped forward, I turned back to ask the old lady if she needed help boarding since she had a cane, but she was gone. Confused, I looked up and down the hill. There was no way she could have walked that far in such a short time. The walk up the hill takes me about 10 minutes, and going down takes at least 5 minutes. She couldn't have vanished so quickly on her own. I stopped and turned to the other student. He was standing frozen, his face pale. It was clear from his expression that he had seen her too, and had no idea where she went. He looked almost like he was in fight or flight mode, completely shocked. After confirming that he had also seen the woman, I calmly boarded the bus and went home. Later, I realized something chilling. If she truly was from one of the first graduating classes of my high school, she would have been at least 130 years old on the day we met her. I think I had my first paranormal encounter. I'm a 17-year-old guy, and I think I might have experienced my first paranormal encounter. Recently, I visited some extended family for the holidays, and my family stayed in a hotel for about a week. We all shared the same room. One evening, I decided to go get some ice, and the ice machine was at the opposite end of the hallway. To paint the picture, midway through my hall, there was another hallway to the left, forming a sideways T-shape. If you imagine the Korean character EO, that's essentially what it looked like from my perspective. As I was approaching that intersection, an old man walked up from the other hallway. He looked incredibly old. There's no way he could have been younger than his 80s. He was moving slowly, slightly hunched over, and shaky in that way some elderly people are. When he got to the intersection, he stopped and just stood there, looking around like he was confused. He didn't acknowledge me at first, just seemed lost. I said, "Hello," and that's when he suddenly widened his eyes and looked at me, startled, like I had just woken him from a deep sleep. And I wasn't even talking loudly. I asked, "You good?" He smiled, nodded, and then pointed at me. He opened his mouth like he was about to speak, but no words came out. He just kept smiling. The whole thing was kind of awkward, so I said, "Have a nice day," and he nodded again. I kept walking forward toward the ice machine, but I turned back after a few seconds to check on him. He was still standing there but wasn't looking at me. He was just staring off into space, looking lost again. I continued on to the ice machine, but as I walked, I started to feel bad. Like maybe he was someone's grandpa who had wandered off. I decided to turn back and check on him, but when I got back, he was gone. The hallway I was in was long and straight, so the only place he could have gone was back in the direction he came from. I quickly power walked that way to look for him, but he wasn't there either. The elevator was down the hallway he had come from, but it just didn't add up. The interaction and my decision to go back happened so quickly that there's no way he could have moved that fast, especially considering how slowly he had been walking. I also didn't hear any doors open or close, which would have been the only other explanation. It honestly feels like the old man might have been some kind of ghost. There's just no way he could have disappeared like that otherwise. My hospital stay. On September 3rd, I spent the night at a hospital for epilepsy, completely unaware that I was walking into something much darker. I didn't know that the hospital was haunted, or, more accurately, that the room I was staying in had a reputation for being deeply cursed. It was just me and my boyfriend, and at first, everything seemed fine. But by the next morning, my boyfriend seemed shaken. He told me that during the night, the lights had been flickering, and that he kept feeling cold spots moving around the room. I didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to nerves, or maybe the hospital's old wiring. That morning, we casually mentioned it to the nurse. Her response made my blood run cold. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly, speaking in a low voice. "You're staying in one of our haunted rooms." She explained that the hospital had a long, grim history. It had originally been a psychiatric hospital decades ago, known for housing the criminally insane. The room we were staying in, she said, had once been occupied by a notorious patient, a very bad man who had done unspeakable things before and during his stay there. She offered to move us to a different room, but we brushed it off. We figured she was just trying to scare us or pass the time with a creepy story. But then things started getting worse. That night, I kept waking up at odd hours, startled by something I couldn't quite place. Every time, the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the room itself was suffocating me. At one point, I opened my eyes and saw what looked like black smoke swirling in the corner of the room. I blinked, thinking I must be seeing things, but it didn't go away. The lights kept flickering, not just once or twice, but constantly. My boyfriend said he felt like something was watching him, and at one point, he swore he saw a shadow move across the wall, except nothing in the room could have caused it. By the fourth night, we were both exhausted and on edge. I kept feeling like something was brushing against me, light and cold, like fingertips grazing my skin. My boyfriend said he heard faint whispers. Every time I started to fall asleep, I'd wake up moments later, heart pounding, with no idea why. The final straw came when I woke up and saw the black smoke again. This time, it wasn't in the corner. It was hovering at the foot of my bed, slowly shifting and taking on a vaguely human shape. I froze, unable to move or even call out to my boyfriend. All I could do was stare as it loomed closer. When I finally managed to scream, the lights flickered violently, then went completely out. My boyfriend grabbed my arm, and we bolted out of the room. The nurse didn't seem surprised when we told her we wanted to change rooms. She didn't say much, just helped us move and muttered, "I told you that room was haunted." Now I'm supposed to stay in another hospital in a week, and all I can think about is whether I'll end up back in that same building. If I do, there's no way I'm going near that room again. I think I saw something in my dorm. I've been replaying this in my mind since it happened, and every time I think about it, I get this unsettling, nagging feeling. When my college went on break, most students left right after finals. I had to stay behind for an extra 2-3 days, because my dad couldn't get off work right away to pick me up. The dorms were practically empty by then, and the silence in the halls felt strange, like the building was holding its breath. The night before my dad was supposed to arrive, I decided to do some laundry. It was late, around 10 p.m. I figured I'd have the laundry room to myself since almost everyone was already gone. For some context, my dorm used to be a hotel before it was repurposed. You can still tell by the layout. One side of the building has the motel-style rooms with outdoor entrances, while the other side looks more like a traditional hotel. The building has this weird energy, like it hasn't quite shed its past, even though they remodeled it. Around midnight, I went to check if my clothes were dry. They weren't, so I restarted the dryer and left the laundry room. As I walked back to my dorm, I passed through the motel-style corridor, which runs parallel to the hotel-style section. The two sides face each other, so you can look into the hotel rooms from the hallway I was in if the curtains are open. That's when I saw it. In one of the hotel rooms, there were 2 beds. One bed was stripped bare, and the mattress was propped against the wall. The other bed had sheets on it, but it didn't look slept in. At first glance, the room seemed empty, but then I noticed a boy sitting on the bed frame where the empty mattress should have been. He was wearing all black, basketball shorts and a hoodie, and his legs were swinging back and forth like a kid idly passing the time. His head was tilted down, so I couldn't see his face. I assumed he was just a guest or maybe a little brother visiting someone still in the dorms. But something felt off. As I stared, it hit me. The bed frame was bare metal, with wide springs. There was no way someone could sit on it like that without falling through. The mattress was clearly against the wall behind him, and yet there he was, swinging his legs as if the mattress were still there. I froze, feeling this overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. It wasn't just fear. It was sadness, too. A deep, heavy sorrow that made my chest ache. I told myself to keep walking and not think about it. Don't look too hard. Don't give it too much attention. I looked down at the floor, willing my feet to move, but something inside me needed to check again. When I glanced back up, he was gone. The room was completely empty. No boy, no movement. My stomach dropped, and I felt chills run up my spine. I hurried back to my room, practically running by the time I got to the door. Once I was inside, I locked it, sat on the edge of my bed, and just stared at the wall. I don't know how long I sat there, but I couldn't shake the image of that boy or the way he made me feel. Visiting the grandkids. I never had the chance to meet my father-in-law. He passed away 5 years before I met my wife. If he were alive today, he'd have 9 grandchildren, including my kids. Sadly, he only got to meet 2 of them in his lifetime. My wife keeps a framed photo of him on her nightstand. It's of the 2 of them dancing when she was around 15 or 16. In the picture, they're both looking at the camera, his head tilted back slightly, with a larger-than-life smile that radiates pure joy. It's the kind of photo that makes you smile just by looking at it, even if you never met the man. A copy of that photo, and others like it, is at my mother-in-law's house. They all have the same theme: his infectious smile, his zest for life. By all accounts, he was the life of every party, the guy who could get anyone on the dance floor. More importantly, he was a devoted family man, grateful for the time he got to spend with his 2 granddaughters while battling the illness that eventually took him. Fast forward 18 years. All 9 grandchildren were together, home for a family gathering. The oldest 2, now in college, came back for the potluck at my mother-in-law's house. Despite the 15-year age gap between the oldest and youngest, they all get along remarkably well. The older cousins are sweethearts when it comes to entertaining the little ones. At my eldest child's insistence, we invited all 9 kids for a sleepover at our house. We ordered pizza, set up air mattresses, and brought out video games for the kids to enjoy in my daughter's room. Naturally, it was a no adults allowed zone. For context, our house is relatively new. It was built in 2014 on what used to be an empty lot. There's no dark history, no urban legends tied to it. The layout is straightforward. 3 bedrooms upstairs. The master bedroom is immediately to the right when you come up the stairs, and the other 2 bedrooms are on the left. If the master bedroom door is open, you can see directly down the hallway and catch anyone coming up the stairs. That evening, after the kids shut themselves in for their pajama party, my wife busied herself with chores, while I lounged in bed watching TV. Normally, I close the bedroom door when watching TV to keep any content unsuitable for kids out of sight. But as my wife kept popping in and out, she eventually left the door open. It must have been around 9 or 10 p.m. when I noticed someone coming up the stairs. This wasn't a shadow or some vague apparition. It was a person. I heard the steady sound of footsteps, and when they reached the landing, I got a clear view of them. It was my father-in-law. He looked just like the man in the picture, full of life, dressed in casual clothes, and sporting that signature, disarming smile. He wasn't ghostly or distorted. He was solid, as real as anyone. I froze, startled. Though I've had a fair share of paranormal experiences, this felt different. "Hello, mister. How are you?" I asked, the words tumbling out without thought. He smiled wider, his expression warm and reassuring. "I'm fine, thank you. I'm here to visit the kids," he said in a calm, even tone. I was stunned. His voice was exactly how I imagined it might be, though I'd never heard it before. I nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. "Okay," I replied. He nodded back, then turned and walked toward the kids' room. I sat there for a moment, waiting to hear screams or laughter from the kids, but the room stayed quiet. I paused the show and debated telling my wife what had just happened. She's deeply sentimental about her father, and gets uneasy when I talk about paranormal experiences, but there was no hiding this. She knows me too well to miss when something's on my mind. When I told her, she bombarded me with questions. What did he look like? What was he wearing? Did you hear his voice, or was it in your head? I answered as best as I could, describing his clothes, his smile, his calm demeanor. I told her that it wasn't just in my head. His lips moved when he spoke. It was as real as any conversation. Tears streamed down her face as she listened. I wish I had seen him, she whispered. I'm his daughter. Why didn't he come to me? I held her as she cried, unsure of what to say. The only thing I could do was share the overwhelming feeling I had when he was there. That he loved us, that he was watching over his grandchildren, and that he was happy to see them all together. She calmed down eventually, but asked me not to tell the kids or the rest of the family. I agreed.